Today, in this module, I'm talking to you about overcoming shame after psychosis or in psychosis. And I'm presenting this to you as a lived experience educator, a senior psychologist, and a senior lecturer in the tertiary education sector. The first question that's important is, why does shame matter? And why does shame often matter so much more than we think? For example, in recovery. So first of all, shame after experiencing a psychotic episode predicts avoidance and delayed help seeking. So it directly impacts upon the willingness of people to reach out, get the help they need, and that help is often instrumental in them recovering from their psychotic episode. Shame silences people long after the symptoms of psychosis resolve. And so shame can have a very long tail. So, in my own experience, for example, I experienced a psychotic depressive episode, a few actually. And while my psychotic symptoms each time resolved very quickly within the course of a week with adequate treatment, the shame that I experience afterwards and the shame that I see in clients, that I see in people in my network, it often lasts for years after experiencing a psychotic episode. Shame undermines identity, confidence, and relationships. So often people feel very hesitant to let themselves be seen, to put themselves out there, and to openly share their experience in the mental health field with their loved ones, even direct family members or very close friends. And additionally, and finally, shame is a very strong predictor of recovery trajectory. So, what we often see is that people who manage their shame more successfully and who experience lower levels of shame after psychosis, they have more swift recovery trajectories, and often they reach higher levels of baseline of functional recovery post psychosis. So shame is a really important variable. It's a really important factor after psychosis, as well as after many other mental health conditions. But shame is often very intense after psychosis, given that there's still a lot of stigma around this illness. So the lived experience of shame, how does this look? So some examples of how the lived experience of shame looks is that people might think or say, I cannot trust my mind anymore. My mind betrayed me. How can I ever trust it again? People often experience identity disruption. So they wonder, who am I now that I have experienced this psychotic episode, or now I'm experiencing psychotic symptoms? Am I still the same person, or am I fundamentally a different person? And they need to integrate that psychotic experience into their identity. Often people feel irreparably damaged or broken. And so that psychosis narrative and that psychosis part of their identity can often be very strong if there's a lot of shame. And what we want to work towards is to integrate that more into a person's identity so that it becomes one of many variables, one of many factors that shape who we are as a person. And then finally, there's often fear of stigma and wanting to hide what happened. So people can often be very hesitant to come forward with their experiences of psychosis or psychotic symptoms. And they often don't want to talk about what happened to them, whether that's with family or friends or whether that's in therapy. And so this video today is meant for people with lived experience of psychosis, their friends and family members, but also for mental health professionals like psychologists who work with people with psychosis and different psychotic illnesses, for example, psychotic depression, as I have experienced, or schizophrenia, or stress induced psychosis. So there are, broadly speaking, three sources of shame. First of all, there's internal shame. So that's often taking the form of harsh self-judgments. So I'm stupid or I'm broken are examples of that. I should have been stronger. And there can often be that internalized fear of a recurrence of our mind breaking again. And then secondly, there is interpersonal sources of shame. So often other people in our environment, like friends, family, health professionals, they might interact with us in a way that communicates shame or that communicates stigma to a person with previous experience or current experience of psychosis. So people might silence the experience or are talking about the experience, or people might minimize it by saying things like, oh, everything happens for a purpose, or this and this person has it worse. On the other end of the spectrum, alarmed reactions, so people who really freak out and who get really anxious really strongly, can also be a source of shame for people who have experienced or are experiencing psychosis. And often people can experience a loss of trust in the person with psychosis, whether that's family members or perhaps colleagues at work. Often people kind of lower their expectations, even in the long run, even after the person has recovered. And then finally, there are systemic sources of shame. So there's are wider spread institutional expressions of stigma and shame after psychosis. So, for example, stigma in the media. How does the media report about people with psychosis? Often the reporting is quite skewed towards people with psychosis being violent, for example. While when we look at the statistics, we actually see that that's only a very small minority of people with psychosis that are violent. For clinicians, if we're too risk focused in our clinical culture or in our sessions, at the expense of showing empathy and at the expense of exploring, for example, strengths of someone who is experiencing or has experienced psychosis, then we're also contributing to that systemic system of shame and perpetuating that same shame cycle. And also, lack of recovery narratives contributes to systemic elements of shame after psychosis. So often there's a lot of focus on the immediate acute period of illness where the psychotic symptoms are very prevalent, but there is very little narrative on what happens afterwards in recovery, right? And so for me, for example, I have recovered completely. I don't have any remaining psychotic symptoms. I hold a high powered job as a senior psychologist, senior academic lecturer. I am a mother to two teenage daughters, etc. And I'm not alone, right? There are many people who very successfully recover from or manage and navigate their psychotic illness. So, unintentional contributors to shame, very briefly recapping, is things like focusing solely on risk, avoiding the topic of psychosis entirely when the person who has experienced it or is experiencing it doesn't bring it up themselves, using physics based language. So, only focusing on what's wrong, what's not going well, over pathologizing normal recovery struggles. So, recovery is a non linear, difficult process, and there is no one size fits all. So, it's only normal to have setback periods within recovery where things feel more difficult, where we might experience some questions around, are we experiencing some delusions perhaps or hallucinations again, and how do we navigate that? And also, another unintentional contributor to shame is not exploring identity or meaning of the experience. So it's really important to integrate that experience of psychosis into our identity and engage in a meaning making process around that. So, what kind of a role has this played in our life? And likely there will be both negative as well as neutral, and hopefully some positive elements to that experience. So, then importantly, the question is, what helps lift shame after psychosis? So, one thing that's really important is to name the psychotic experience and the symptoms without judgment and without hiding them. Second thing is normalizing identity reconstruction. So it's very normal to be confused about how does psychosis now fit into your identity? What is your new identity? And which elements are part of that? And that's a process that takes time. And that's an ongoing process as well, as psychotic illnesses might develop and might present us with relapses or reoccurrences of the illness. But also it gets further reconstructed, redefined as we, for example, share our story more with other people. So I have been lately sharing my story, for example, on my Psychology Today blog and on my YouTube channel. And that's the next step. Even though I had processed my own experience and made sense of that in terms of my identity over the past couple of years, this is another layer. And so now I have to integrate in my identity that I'm more, I guess, publicly visible as someone with lived experience of psychosis. And then finally, we want to emphasize dignity and agency of the person who is either sitting in front of us or is our friend or family member, or to ourselves. We want to emphasize our dignity and agency if it is us who have gone through psychosis, right? And always, as with any psychiatric illness or psychological illness, try to use strengths inclusive language, right? So don't only focus on negatives, deficits, etc., but also think about what are your strengths, what are your clients' strengths, what are your friend or family members' strengths, and how have they successfully navigated such a difficult, such a scary experience, really. So, principles for shame informed practice, then finally, is some things like ask, what did this experience mean to you, right? How was the experience for you? How have you grown after experiencing such a difficult episode in your life? Validate the emotional impact. So, really validate that it has been, for example, very distressing, very scary. People might have experienced terror during their psychotic episodes. And reinforce agency and autonomy. So, regardless of whether your friend or a family member or psychologist of someone who has experienced psychosis, really reinforce that agency and that this is a person who can make their own adult decisions, right? Psychosis doesn't render them, or past psychotic experience doesn't render them incapable of embodying that agency and autonomy, right? Guide them, be there for them, but don't take over that role and don't infantilize them, basically. Support return to valued roles, that's another thing, and use recovery oriented messaging again. So, all of these things together, they really form the bones of shame informed, resilient practice, right? And support. So, if you find this module useful, please feel free to use this resource. So the video, and there are two handouts as well, two PDF handouts. One is for clinicians and support people of those people who have experienced psychotic episodes or psychosis. And the second handout is for people with lived experience of psychosis, right? So two handouts and this video. And please feel free to use this resource for clinician training or as psychoeducation for people with psychosis experience and their loved ones. If you're able to, please provide me with some feedback on this free education module so we can continue to enhance it further and offer potentially more modules in the future that help provide hope, help increase care provided to people who have experienced psychosis, and also provide training to clinicians like psychologists, for example, counselors, social workers who work with people who have experienced psychosis. You can provide feedback via the email address on this slide, so via admin@joycevromen.com. And you can also follow me on YouTube at the handle @joycevromen PhD. Thank you, and I hope this resource is useful for you.